Okay, welcome back. This is part 2 of the Week 10 lecture, and I'll try to keep this relatively brief. But the final thing to remember about the third waivers and sort of the distinction between the second wave, one of the many distinctions between second and third wave, is that the second waivers were kind of more, they were big on a collective definition of femininity, and feminism as well. They were big on collective action and this sense of kind of unity, kind of female solidarity. Again, that's a bit of a generalization, but it's largely true. But the third waivers kind of have a different take on it. They think that feminism should be defined on more of an individual basis. So each individual can sort of determine what feminism means to them. So, which I think is fine by and large. I mean, I sort of support, individual choice, but just as kind of an observation, this does probably lead to some of our current sort of present day difficulties with defining this term. Because again, this wasn't as much of a problem with the second waivers because they were all kind of working with a shared definition of most of these terms, like what femininity meant, what feminism meant. Whereas third waivers are more likely to have distinctive individual definitions, and of course there'll be overlap and there'll be similarities, but there'll also be some key differences that can make sort of a unified understanding of the term sometimes difficult. But again, second waiver is a little bit more collective, third waivers a little bit more focused on the individual. So I want to move on and talk about Elaine Showalter's 3 phases of women's literary development. You might remember we used this model weeks ago when we were talking about the environmental approach, and we used Showalter's 3-part sort of model of development to track the growth and development of the environmental approach. But now let's actually go to the original and look at how Showalter tracks the development of women's writing, women's literature. So she starts with phase 1, which she calls the feminine phase. And again, she's talking about America specifically. She's an American lit scholar. So for her, the feminine phase begins in the 1840s, which is kind of the beginning of the first wave of feminism in the States. Like I said, it had kind of already been existing in England a little bit longer. But this is kind of at the beginning of the first wave in the States, and it lasts up until like the late 19th century. So she defines the feminine phase as a period in which the women writers were largely imitating male writers. And that was just sort of the accepted technique because men dominated the literary marketplace. Okay. And then the second phase, according to her, is what she calls the feminist phase, beginning at the end of the 19th century and extending all the way up until the passage of the 20th Amendment in 1920. So during this phase, of course, women are advocating for their rights, and they are fighting against oppression and second-class status and all of that. But also, in a strictly literary sense, what Showalter talks about is during the feminist phase, what women are largely doing when it comes to works of literature is they're going to some of these classic, celebrated novels and other works of lit, and they're sort of re-examining them and finding evidence of misogyny, sort of, unequal societal structures, ways that women are silenced, ways that women are denied agency. And they're really focused on kind of uncovering that oppression, uncovering those injustices in these, pre-existing texts largely written by men and largely thought of as being great works of literature. And then the third phase is what Showalter calls the female phase. That seems too general. But I guess she's really just talking about this as kind of a true discovery of the female in the written word. So now in the female phase, which begins after the 20s and kind of extends all the way up to present day, now the focus isn't so much on uncovering misogyny in older texts. Now it's more about rediscovering women's texts, rediscovering important literature written by women, often written about women, and often, frankly, neglected, ignored for a long time. Not necessarily included in what we call the American literary canon, which basically just means the collection of all the best texts written in American literature. So this, again, as they mention in the book, this is starting to change. The American literary canon is opening up, and we're starting to add more texts to it. Increasingly more texts written by women, more texts written by African Americans, more texts written by Latino or Latino writers, Native American writers, other immigrant groups. So it is changing for the better, but this change has kind of been a long time coming. So they mention a few examples. They mention Harriet Wilson, who was the first African American woman to publish a work of fiction in America, I believe in the late 1850s. So they mention her and how she was rediscovered by this scholar, Henry Louis Gates, who's still alive. He used to teach at Princeton, I think. But he basically rediscovered Wilson. She had not been studied. She had not been talked about for generations. And he kind of brought her back. And now she's studied quite a bit. And she's often included in American literary survey, classes. Also, just sticking with Gates for a minute, he also helped to rediscover Phyllis Wheatley, who was an African American poet from the late 18th century. And she's commonly taught now as well, but for many years she was not. And again, kind of forgotten, kind of neglected, not originally included in the canon. But Wheatley's a really important figure. She's one of the first published poets in America. And it wasn't even an independent nation yet when she was writing. We were still colonies. She was brought to colonial Boston as a slave. She belonged to an affluent family, and unlike many slaves, she was actually taught how to read and write and was given an education, and at a young age discovered a natural gift for poetry. So I believe she published her volume of poetry in 1773. I should know that because I teach Wheatley. I believe it's 1773. She was 17. She was a kid when that volume came out. She died young, unfortunately. She wrote some other stuff, but that volume contains most of the poems that we still study and have today. But she was kind of a prodigy. But just kind of a little aside, it was her poetry was so good, and it sounded so similar to kind of classical models from England and earlier European traditions that many citizens of colonial Boston did not believe that an African American could write it. So she was actually forced to go to this kind of like semi-trial, like a hearing, a public hearing with these local politicians and town leaders. And they made her perform like various exercises to prove that she was actually the author of her poetry. So this was all kind of lost to history until Gates came along and not only kind of brought back Wheatley's poetry, but he found these colonial records of this hearing that really happened when she had to come and prove to these old white guys that she was the author of these poems. And they eventually ruled in her favor. They said, okay, she really did it. Gates even found the documentation of that hearing, and he helped to publicize that. So now we teach this stuff. Now we know it. But for a long time, we did not. So that's really what they mean. That's what Showalter means when she's talking about that third phase, right? That shift away from finding misogyny in men's texts and a new emphasis on rediscovering and championing women's texts that, again, have been neglected, have been kind of obscure for a long time. Just one more example before we move on. Harriet Spofford Harriet was a very common name, apparently, back then. Harriet Spofford was a white woman, pretty popular during her time. She wrote poetry, short stories, novels, nonfiction as well. She was a contemporary of Emily Dickinson, but for a long time she was not in the canon. She was kind of forgotten, but she got rediscovered. And again, not only was she a contemporary of Dickinson, but we know that they read each other. Dickinson writes about reading Spofford in her correspondence, in her letters. So we also teach Dickinson now, and Dickinson is very much a part of the American canon, but she didn't used to be. It just so happens that Emily Dickinson kind of got rediscovered sooner than some of these other figures. She got kind of brought back to our attention in the early 1900s. But for a while, she too had fallen into obscurity and people weren't really reading her. So again, we don't need to talk about the canon too much, but it really kind of got created right after World War II, like in the 40s, 50s, the middle of the 20th century, as the study of American literature became really established at the college level. And there's been lots of research done on this topic. When the canon was created, women were left out. And if you guys know anything about, classic 19th century American lit, which is what they were largely focusing on, you know that most of the heavy hitters, when it comes to American literature from the 1800s, they're mostly men, right? I mean, Melville, Poe, Hawthorne, Emerson, Thoreau, Whitman. It's a male-heavy group. Now, Dickinson kind of gets thrown into the mix, but if we move later into the 19th century, we're talking about Mark Twain, we're talking about Jack London, we're talking about Upton Sinclair, Theodore Dreiser. It's largely a cast of men. But again, that is changing slowly. And it's changing in large part due to some of the work done by feminist critics and scholars, but also, again, there's been a lot of work done with minority groups, but feminist scholars have helped to rediscover a lot of text written by women. So the final thing just to mention with Showalter is she talks about the 4 models of difference that are supposedly used by feminists, both when they are writing and when they are analyzing other people's writing. So this, to me, some of what Showalter's doing here, it's kind of classic sort of second wave stuff, and some of it gets a little bit rejected by the third wave, but I just wanted to run through her 4 models quickly and see if you guys can kind of buy into these models of difference. Do you think they really are models of difference, or do you think the difference is not as profound or as important as Showalter might suggest? So the 4 models are biological, so that means differences based on bodies, male versus female bodies. Number 2 is linguistic difference, so that means difference found in language, and that's an interesting one. And then they mention psychoanalytic difference. That just means like differences in the psyche, differences in the mind between men and women. And then cultural difference. And this is the one that's still very pertinent today and is still very much with us today. Differences based on certain social contexts, like race, class, nationality. I think most people still acknowledge that those differences matter. Differences based on race, class, where you're from, how much money you have, all of that matters. But there is a lot of debate, and a lot of third wavers would reject the biological difference. And it's not because most people acknowledge that biological difference is real. There are certain anatomical differences between men and women in terms of the reproductive system, sex organs. But the problem a lot of third wavers would have with Showalter's focus on biological difference is that it kind of reduces people just to their bodies, right? How important is it really for literature or for culture? How important is it really that women bear children and men don't? Right, that's obviously a biological difference, but third wavers would say, does it matter when we're analyzing lit? Like beyond just like maybe certain plot points, like this character is giving birth. So that's kind of the issue there. And then I'm really interested, and actually I wanted to share a little bit from the chapter here. This is on page 259 when they're talking about linguistic difference. This is very interesting to me. I don't really have an answer here. I just would like to hear your opinions. Showalter and others argued that there were certain linguistic qualities that were unique to women. In other words, women use language in ways that are different than the ways that men often use language. And again, a lot of third wavers would reject that and say maybe there's some difference, but it's all constructed by society. It doesn't exist innately. It's not natural. It's just the way people think they have to be. So they might reject it as a real difference, a real source of difference. And they might also reject the idea that male and female brains are fundamentally different. Although, again, I think science probably indicates that there are some differences. But again, how important are those differences? Do those differences help us understand, say, literary characters? Do they help us understand art? Do they help us understand our society, our culture, our country? That might be really where the debate comes in. But just to stick for a moment with the linguistic difference, this is at the bottom of 259. So the very last paragraph. Though women writers may have to use male language, and again, what exactly does that mean? Feminist critics have identified sex-related writing strategies that women primarily use, such as the use of associational rather than linear logic. So I want you guys to form your own opinions of that. Do we think linear thinking, like chronological, start to finish, first to last, is that kind of logical thinking masculine, and is more associational thinking or logic feminine? Do we agree with that? And they go on. Other feminine artistic choices might be free play of meaning. I don't really know if I know what that means, but I think it might tie back to the deconstruction, the kind of maybe the idea that meaning is not set in stone, that meaning can change and there's infinite possibilities, maybe. I don't really know. And then a lack of closure. So again, they're saying that women writers often have a lack of closure in their work because that's kind of a feminine strategy, or is what they call a sex-related writing strategy. I don't know if I buy all of that. And then but you guys, I want to hear your opinions. And then they get into what they talk about as genre preferences. And again, I think there's some truth to some of this, but I also think you have to be very careful. So they mention genre preferences, such as women kind of preferring epistolary works, works that are structured like letters, journals, confessional writing, domestic narratives. I mean, that's kind of true, but just, again, I don't want to get lost in the weeds here, but I am sort of a student of 19th century American lit. That's my area. And it's a common misconception that I just sort of have a problem with it because it's too easy. People say that, women in the 19th century wrote what are called domestic novels or sentimental novels, novels that are often centered around romantic relationships or family relationships, or they're kind of centered in the home, because that was the sphere that most women operated in, as we know, during that time period. So these were books that were often coded as feminine. They were often thought of as being written by women for women, and that isn't wrong. But men wrote those books too. And that's what people sometimes forget. Men read those books too. They weren't just for women, and they weren't just created for women. And of course, not all women liked sentimental novels. So I think it's too easy for us to fall into this habit of saying certain genres are for the ladies and certain genres are for the guys. There can be some cultural foundations for those beliefs. Again, think about movies, right? Action movies are often coded as male. Detective, cop dramas are often coded as male, whereas romantic comedies, well, those are female, right? That doesn't mean that we don't expect some men to enjoy them, but we expect the majority of the audience for romantic comedies to be women. But again, a lot of third wavers who buy into more of a constructivist view of gender would say, women don't have to like romantic comedies. They're just told to like romantic comedies, just like men are told to like action movies. There's nothing natural in men liking that. They're just told that they're supposed to like it. So that kind of takes us to the final thing I wanted to cover before we return to Millet and then I wrap up. This idea of a constructivist view on gender. So they mention this definition in the book. So an essentialist view is more of like what the second waivers were talking about, this essential female identity that all women share despite their individual differences. And it's kind of innate, it's natural, right? And it is in some ways steeped in biology. Whereas the third waivers, by and large, sort of adopt more of a constructivist view. And a constructivist view basically means that gender, what we think of as gender and gender difference, and also, of course, notions of femininity, all of that is constructed. All of it is made. It's not natural. It's not innate. It's not inherent. It's constructed. It's made. It's man-made. And it's largely constructed and enforced by society and history, right? So it's this idea that women wrote domestic novels because they weren't given opportunities to write a lot of other kinds of novels. But yet they still did. Some women did write. Many women wrote outside of that one genre. But yes, the genre was made made popular by women authors, which again, just to finish an earlier thought, this is part of the uncovered history that we're increasingly becoming aware of. The best-selling authors in early America were women. Not Melville, not Hawthorne. Those guys were known, but they weren't immensely popular. The first best-selling author in America was Susanna Rowson, who wrote a book called Charlotte Temple in the 1790s. It was a seduction plot it was a very popular form of sentimental fiction of that era about a young girl seduced by a sort of rakish military officer. It was the best-selling book in America for nearly 60 years. And for a long time, nobody read Charlotte Temple. It wasn't in the canon. It wasn't taught in survey classes. And it was largely forgotten. And when people wrote their histories of American lit, they would say, oh, the first popular American author was probably Washington Irving, and he was popular, but they completely forgot about Rowson. They forgot about her bestseller. Irving never sold as many copies as Rowson sold. Never. And somebody like Melville, who had fallen into obscurity by the end of his life, he wasn't anywhere close. Hawthorne, one of the famous male authors of the 19th century, had a famous quote where he said, I can't make any headway with my books because of that what did he say? The damned mob of scribbling women. Kind of a famous quote, a very derogatory quote. And he was sort of lamenting that these sentimental novelists like Susanna Rowson and later like Harriet Beecher Stowe, who wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin, another Harriet, they were so much more popular than him. Their books sold so much better than his did. But what's funny is 100 years later, from the point that Hawthorne made that comment, it's Hawthorne that goes in the canon, not Rowson, not Stowe, although they were included later. So again, this is the sort of history of feminine texts, of female texts, that a lot of third waivers have helped to uncover. And this is kind of that final stage of Showalter's development of women's literature, this understanding that women have a literary history of their own. That's often been ignored by the male scholars and the male critics who helped to create the curriculum, create the canon, and write the histories. So that was a little bit of a digression. Okay, so let's go back to what I was going to talk about, which was that constructivist idea. Right. So again, I was talking about sentimental novels. Yeah. So again, Charlotte, Rowson, Stowe, very popular, sold a lot of books and then forgotten. But you could argue that they wrote sentimental novels not because of some essential female quality that makes females like those kinds of books, but because they were so limited. They had few rights. They didn't have the kinds of opportunities or the kinds of educations or the kinds of economic advantages that would have allowed them to write other stuff or do other stuff. So they were confined by society, by the culture. So it's not so much about natural feminine or female identity. It's more about how these gender roles get constructed by society. So you guys need to kind of figure out where you land in that debate. Do you believe in some of these like essential qualities of men and women? Or do you think most of what we consider gender, of course, again, we know that there are certain biological differences that are not really up for dispute. But again, now we're starting to sort of understand that maybe there are people that identify as women who don't necessarily have a traditional female anatomy. That's becoming something that was not accepted in previous generations. It increasingly is now. So, how important are those biological differences? Some people still think they're very important and that they're the foundation for gender roles. Other people say gender roles are just created by society. So, what do you think about that? Okay, finally, let's go back to Kate Millett, and I just want to spend a little bit of time with Sexual Politics, because it's a great book. I wish I could share some of it with you guys, but again, I can't find it for free, and I don't want to make you read it. It's quite long, but the structure of it is pretty simple. She basically takes on three big titans of the literary scene, 2 American authors and 1 English. Again, they're all men. If you guys see that documentary I posted in the Week 10 module, it's actually based on what she said about Norman Mailer. I don't know if you guys know Mailer. He was a very famous American novelist of the 20th century. He wrote The Naked and the Dead, The Executioner's Song. He was quite famous, kind of a celebrity in his time. We still read him. He still gets taught. Great writer, and I do admire his artistry. He's also kind of regarded as a bit of an ass, kind of pompous, arrogant, which again, unfortunately, a lot of famous writers are that way. But she's kind of taken on Mailer. She's taken on Henry Miller, who wrote Tropic of Cancer. He was kind of known for writing very sexually explicit fiction. And again, he's a good writer, but to me, he's always kind of seemed like a bit of an adolescent boy. And then D.H. Lawrence, who's an English writer from the early 20th century, famous for Sons and Lovers, Lady Chatterley's Lover, which is the book that she discusses specifically. So she kind of takes on these 3 guys, but she's kind of working within that kind of feminist phase that Showalter identifies, where she's re-examining classic texts by men to sort of uncover misogyny and a very limited male perspective that, in her opinion, it's not just, they're misogynist, because most people would probably agree with that, at least when it comes to Mailer. But it's sort of, I don't want to say that because there is still debate, but more importantly for her, it's sort of like the misogyny undercuts the artistry. The misogyny makes them not as good in certain ways, makes them not as perceptive, makes them not as skillful in creating their fictional worlds. So she starts with Miller, and again, he's known for his sort of obsession with sex. So she makes, I think, the indisputable point, if you've ever read Miller, that he often refers to women largely based on their body parts, and he's largely focused on their sexual body parts. So again, she basically says Miller reduces all women to sex. To him, all women are that biological difference, right? He's only focused on their bodies and their sex functions. Yeah, I think most people agree with that now. Norman Mailer, she has a more complex criticism of him. So, on one hand, she compliments Mailer, and she says he is actually very good at diagnosing some of the real problems in the masculine mind. Her quote is, he has a great understanding of what is most dangerous in the masculine sensibility. Those are her words. He understands what is most dangerous in the masculine sensibility. And I've taught The Naked and the Dead before. It's sort of like a classic World War II novel. I think it's Mailer's best work. And of course, it's a war novel. It's dominated by male characters. You only see women in the form of like flashbacks with, wives and girlfriends. The whole thing takes place in this Pacific island. They're fighting the Japanese. It's a great book. I mean, it's kind of a masterful novel in a lot of ways. But one thing she points out is that he's really skillful at depicting the sort of hateful and dismissive ways that a lot of men often talk about women. So he has these scenes of dialogue where the men sit around like in the barracks, in their downtime, and they talk a lot of junk about women. In some cases, they're talking about their wives, their girlfriends. In other cases, they're talking about women that they've maybe had casual encounters with or prostitutes. But they often reduce women, much like Miller, they reduce women to body parts and sex. But they also just have a lot of anger towards women more generally. And again, a lot of them are young. A lot of them are still, kids. They're 18, 19 years old. Some of them are a little bit older. But they're all relatively young guys who haven't had a ton of experience in life. But some of them have already married and started families. But like one of the connecting links that kind of unites them all is this fear that all of their wives and girlfriends are cheating on them back home while they're, in the Pacific fighting. So but it's not just jealousy, and Mailer really captures this. Yeah, it's jealousy. It's a natural kind of human thing. I think it transcends gender, but it's more than that. And Mailer knows it. They're not just jealous. They're kind of afraid of female sexuality. Remember, this is the 40s, okay? So it's not quite as enlightened, perhaps, in some ways, as our society is now. And they kind of fear female sexuality because they don't quite understand it. They recognize that it is kind of different than male sexuality, but they can't control it. They don't have any power over their women now that they're in the Pacific, and that bothers them. They can't control their wives' sexuality. They don't fully understand their wives. That's another point that Mailer makes. Some of their anger and even hatred comes from ignorance. Their wives think certain things and do certain things that they don't get, because they don't see the value in like really talking to their wives and learning about their wives, because they don't treat their wives as equals. They don't think that their wives are very substantive, right? They didn't marry their wives because they had great respect for their intellect or their personalities. They married their wives because that was just kind of what you were supposed to do. They married based on looks or convenience. Or this is just the girl I was going steady with. So Mailer really captures that. It's like they don't even know their own wives. They're afraid of their wives. They kind of hate them in some ways. And they also just want to get laid all the time. So there's this really kind of nuanced, not very favorable depiction of a lot of these GIs and how they think about sex and how they think about gender. So Millet follows all of that, and then she's like, so that's good. So we know Mailer's smart, and he's a good writer. However, he's still, stuck in these same old systems and these same ways of thinking. So she claims that he is a prisoner of the virility cult. And you guys probably know what virility means. It just means energy, drive, but manliness. Like virility refers to men, right? It refers to male energy. Sort of like dominance. And it also usually connotes sexual drive. Like it's referencing the sex drive as well. So a virile man would sort of fit the cultural stereotype of sort of what men were supposed to be in the middle of the 20th century, and that has not completely left us. I think certain images of virility are still with us. If you watch late night television, you might see some commercials where they have pills that are supposed to aid certain men in recapturing their virility. So this is like a money-making racket to this day, this obsession with virility. But she claims that Mailer is very much obsessed with it. Mailer would be ordering those pills online if he were from the TV, if he was still alive. And I do believe that part. But this idea that, he's obsessed with being strong and dominant and sort of a traditional man. So Anyway, just to kind of cut to the end here, if you want to check out that documentary, it's kind of worth watching at least parts of it. You don't need to watch the whole thing. So anyway, after Millett published her book, Mailer heard about it and read it and didn't dig it. So he wrote a very angry response to Millett, basically telling her that she was wrong about everything, that he's not a prisoner of virility or whatever. And then he challenged her to a public debate. And Millett turned him down, but what ended up happening is all of these other prominent women authors ended up kind of taking him up on his offer, and there was a public debate. I guess it was a debate. There was a large audience, and it was sort of Mailer versus this group of women writers. And they weren't all saying the same stuff. They all kind of had different positions, different viewpoints. but Mailer is kind of taking on this larger group. And he was a sort of famous critic of feminism. He didn't really accept it as a worthwhile endeavor. And I would encourage you guys to watch a little bit of that. There's still an ongoing debate. Some people claim that the women kind of humiliate Mailer, that he's made to look a fool. And there are times where I think that's true. He gets booed a lot by the audience. And one of the big sticking points is that he insists on calling all of these women lady writers. He always refers to them as lady writers. Which he claimed was like a sign of respect and like old-fashioned chivalry, but a lot of them claimed that it was his way of sort of making them less than, making them a different category of writers that aren't as good as the male writers, but okay, she's good for a lady, maybe. So it's kind of a way of him relegating them to second-class status. So Susan Sontag is one of the women writers there, and she makes that point. And then Mailer responds, yeah, I don't think Mailer always does a great job, but some people will contend that he comes off okay. But it's worth watching just a little bit. They make a documentary out of that actual debate. So again, Millett's not there, but a bunch of women writers are. And again, some people think that Mailer was kind of an easy punching bag because he was such a kind of condescending ass. And even he would kind of admit that in his honest moments. But other people think that there's actually some really interesting intellectual debate going on. So you can watch some of that. The entire film is included there, but you obviously don't have to watch the whole thing. But the final author that Millett takes on in her book is D.H. Lawrence and Lady Chatterley's Lover, which is sort of celebrated as this great classic love story. And it's largely about like passion, sexual passion in part, but also just a great love between this kind of younger protagonist and an older woman. And it's often viewed that way as a great sort of timeless, universal love story that really captures sort of eternal truths about relationships and heterosexual love. But Millett's point is, no, it's really not any of that, because all the stuff about sex, all the stuff about love, it's all completely centered on the male protagonist, Oliver. It's all about his desire. It's all about his body. It's very phallic, if you remember the Freudian stuff that we were talking about. It's all about Oliver, what he wants, what he sees, what he experiences, and even down to the details of his body. And Millett argues that the female character isn't really given much time at all. She's not given equal space. And again, people can say, well, sure, I mean, it's told from a male perspective, it's written by a male, so what do you want? But her point is not so much that, Lawrence sucks for telling this story from Oliver's perspective. Her point is, in our society, a great love story means a man's love story. It's the story of a man's desire. The man pursues the woman. The man conquers the woman. The man experiences the woman. The man thinks about the experiences. Everything is filtered through the male perspective. Her point isn't just about Lawrence, it's about the larger Western literary tradition in England and America. And again, her problem with Lawrence and the book isn't so much the book itself, but it's the way it's regarded as this great classic love story, when in reality, it's just a celebration of male sexual passion. It's not a celebration of sexual passion in general. It's male sexual passion. That's all Lawrence is really interested in. So again, she's making a larger point about these bigger structures of inequality. It's not always about individual men, right? It's often about structures, the larger cultural expectations, or these constructed ideas about gender and gender roles that we all kind of fall into. Even really smart, really good writers like Mailer fall into it. And again, Millett and other feminists would say many women fall into it. Again, like I was saying, many women help to uphold the patriarchy in various ways. But they're just trying to find a new way, a new approach to a lot of these texts. So that's all that we can stand for now. We will finish chapter 8 next week. Let me know if you have any questions.